Hello there, Juan Sepulveda here of the Winding Stairs Freemasonry podcast. Recently, I had a conversation with a brother. His name is Chuck Dunning, and he's the author of the book Contemplative Masonry. And in our conversation, we were discussing various topics, including, is there room in Masonry for meditation? What role does introspection play in the development of a man? And our conversation, I think, was a very enjoyable one that contained a lot of information that I think you'll find useful. Um, in this video, I want you to hear this conversation and see what you can get out of it in order to make your experience in lodge or your experience in studying Freemasonry a more profound one that actually helps you grow as an individual and really make a difference in your life, the life of the people that surround you, and ideally in the community and society as a whole. In addition to having this conversation with me and dedicating this time, Brother Chuck Dunning was generous enough to give me a signed copy of his book. So this signed copy can be yours, and I would like to send it to you if you're the lucky person to get it. I'll give you details about the giveaway at the end of the video after our conversation. But without further ado, I invite you to listen to this conversation with Brother Chuck Dunning on the Winding Stairs. Brother Chuck, thank you so much for being with me today.
Brother Juan, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And you've done so much great work with this podcast that it's an honor now to be part of it.
Oh, brother, thank you so much for the kind words. The honor is absolutely mine. I wanted to let the brothers know that there is a distinction between operative Masons and speculative Masons. And one deals with the physical construction of an edifice, while the other is responsible for the construction of the intangible. A speculative Mason can be looked at someone who takes the teachings of the craft and diligently works to transform a regular man into an exceptional man. And I'm very thankful that men like you have put together some thoughts in order to help men take care of that practical side of the craft. And I wanted to go ahead and explore a little bit of the origin of how you became interested in Masonry, how you became interested in the practice of meditation and introspection, and how the two intersect. Could you give us a little insight into that, please?
Sure. Actually, both of those things have been a part of my life as long as I can remember in some form or another. My father was a Mason. I had Masons, scattered throughout my family and then the men of our church and so on. My father kept a copy of Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma on the bookshelf, as well as Lightfoot's Manual of the Lodge, which was the official Texas Monitor for many years, and it held commentaries that were written by our past Grand Master Jewel P. Lightfoot that were esoteric in nature. And my father wouldn't talk much about Masonry, but I was allowed to read Masonic books because that was okay. And so I grew up reading those books and not understanding much of any of it, but definitely both of those books planted a bug in me that I really wanted more. I wanted to understand this. There was something there that I knew instinctively was very important. In terms of the practice of meditation and other contemplative practices, I grew up in a religious family. Prayer was a big part of our life, and study and reading were big parts of our lives too. I was encouraged to read as a child, and I loved to read. But the formal practice of meditation, my answer to that is that the formal practice of meditation for me didn't begin until I met my first, I guess what I would call official esoteric teacher. And as a philosophy professor that I had in college who taught a course called the Ancient Wisdom Traditions, and it was a course in Western esotericism. And he also taught meditation classes, seminars on the side that weren't for credit. And I took all of those that he taught. And the first system that I learned from him was Kundalini Yoga. And I practiced that for a while. And it just has grown and blossomed into this real rich experience of my life, where I've learned different techniques from many different traditions and systems, and have always seen the relevance to Masonry from the very beginning.
Now, I'm curious, you mentioned that you grew up in a household that was very close to religion and prayer was a big part. Uh, I'm curious, was there any kind of resistance from your family whenever it came to some of these more esoteric and contemplative practices? Because I know growing up myself in a religious household, some of these things are looked upon as taboo, or is something that should be out of reach. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I think that my parents and my siblings have been remarkably supportive. I mean, you think about the time in which I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and in Texas, which has certainly has a reputation for conservatism, and uh, and so I don't think it would shock anybody if my family had been really hesitant and cautious and resistant. But the fact is that they weren't. Um, my family really, on the whole, values an interior life, an internal life, and paying attention to what's going on inside our souls. And I think that they always respected my ability to make good judgment about what was safe and healthy and what wasn't.
No, that's a fortunate position to be in. Would you have any kind of word of advice for someone who perhaps has an inclination to the esoteric and doesn't have that privilege? Perhaps their family has some sort of resistance or some sort of taboo mentality in regards to that type of practice.
Yeah, I think probably a couple of things come to mind. And one is that there are a wealth of contemplative practices and meditative techniques that definitely fall within the mainstream Western religions. There are a number of meditative systems that you might call, or methods, that come out of the monastic traditions of Roman Catholicism and the Orthodox churches, that can be used by Christians of any particular persuasion. And then also, there are a lot of meditative techniques that are just coming out of the mental health world, which is also, my professional background. And so there are a lot of things there that don't have to be too threatening or scary on a religious basis for people that uh, don't really value or understand a lot about contemplative practice, and particularly the practice of meditation. In terms of negotiating family politics, um, I think it's always important to just be transparent and open and listen to people, and try to hear their concerns, and not be too defensive.
Mhm.
I think the first, red flags always instinctively go up in us when we express a concern to someone else, and their response is to be defensive and to come back at us with some kind of attack. That's just absolutely the wrong way to get support from family members for doing something that they regard as unusual and suspect.
That's very helpful. When you were mentioning that there are some religious traditions that actually embrace some of these contemplative practices, a good friend of mine came to mind, and he is a member of the Jesuit order.
Yes.
And one day we were having a conversation about how he practices his prayer,
Mm-hmm.
his whole structure, the whole structure of prayer in the Jesuit order is completely different than that in which I was brought up.
Yeah.
And he actually has this recollection. It almost reminds me of um, what is called loving care meditation,
Mm-hmm.
where you're actually trying to remember an individual that you came across during the day and
Yes.
how the interaction made you feel and how that got you close to Christ. And I thought it was incredibly beautiful and practical the way that he actually approached prayer. So that's one thing that came to mind. The other is that like you mentioned, that some of these meditation practices come out of the field of mental health and don't necessarily have a doctrine attached to it, some sort of religious connotation. So in that regards, there are ways for us to delve deep into our mind, into the deeper recesses of our mind, without necessarily compromising a tradition or a religion.
No, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, and I would encourage anybody that's interested in those sorts of things to just get online and do a little research and find out, what kinds of what you might call secular forms of meditation are out there, as well as things that harmonize really well with whatever your particular religious orientation might be.
Now, I would like to move into looking at the connection of your particular practice. I know you've been in the education and mental health industries for close to 3 decades, right?
Over 3 decades now, yeah.
And you have found an avenue in expressing yourself, expressing your expertise, and seeing how it fits into some of the teachings that we have in Masonry. Could you draw some parallels in some of the ways in which you have find that juncture between Masonry, contemplative practices, and Freemasonry itself?
Sure. I think one of the things that's important to realize is that Masonic ritual repeatedly tells us to pay attention to what's going on inside of us. Um, just with the first lesson that we receive as entered apprentices, when we get that first set of working tools, in order for us to improve ourselves, to release vices and superfluities, and to embrace and develop virtue, we have to pay attention to how we think and the decisions that we make, and how our feelings affect what we do or don't do. And that kind of internal awareness is precisely what contemplative practice is about. Um, these are also the basic fundamentals of being able to develop oneself psychologically. If you want to mature psychologically beyond whatever it is that your circumstances in life have produced for you, then you have to be intentional about looking at how does your psyche work, and what are some ways in which maybe your psyche is in conflict with itself, or maybe some ways in which different parts of you are not in harmony. Peace, harmony, and unity are these essential teachings of Freemasonry. We talk about those are the conditions that characterize the ideal lodge. But we're also taught that the lodge itself is supposed to be a model for our own lives. And so peace, harmony, and unity within ourselves is something we should be striving for. And that requires using our consciousness in different ways, maybe, than the world would typically teach us to do.
I love that. Uh, Considering that we are our best ally and our worst enemy, all wrapped into one, when it comes to the way that we give way to our thoughts and the way that those thoughts actually influence our behavior. I if if you've heard me talk before, you've seen how I really am passionate about that practical side. We have
Yes.
to put to practice these lessons into our life. And what you mentioned about having that harmony inside, in how it reflects in our actions, it somewhat reminds me of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's being
Yes.
able to recognize that. Can you elaborate a little bit on on what that particular type of therapy is?
Sure, sure. The idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that everything we do is the result of a decision of some sort. This is one way of understanding CBT. And those decisions, of course, are based upon different attitudes and beliefs that we have about things. And the decision processes, some of those decision processes we make very carefully. They're very conscious and intentional and carefully thought out, and others are less so. And sometimes even more instinctual than they are really carefully thought out, or something that we engage consciously. And so in cognitive behavioral therapy, an important part of the process is understanding the dynamics of how we make decisions, and what we can do in order to make more rational decisions, things that will be more likely to lead us in the directions that we want to go in our life, that will be more likely to produce the kinds of results that we're looking for in life. Um, and and essentially, I think that's what Masonry is asking us to do. So, why wouldn't we want to look at the different systems and schools of thought out there in the world that have produced really good results, that have been successful and scientifically proven,
Mhm.
to help people make these kinds of changes in their life? So I think there's a real clear connection there.
I, and your suggestion of looking outside of that fence of masonry, I think
Yeah.
it's a very critical one, especially for those uh, brothers who are looking to practice
Mm-hmm.
the art of masonry. In one thing that I come across oftentimes, if I were to ask a question, what books are you reading? I usually go
Mm-hmm.
to my Facebook group and it's like, what books are you reading? And even if I make a explicit qualification that it's what are you reading outside of masonry?
Yeah.
Inevitably, most masons that reply, they're limiting their reading to just Masonic things, Masonic
Yes.
books. And I understand it and I respect it, but there is so much more out there that informs what happens within the craft. Um, and like you said, practices or techniques or philosophies that have actually yielded a positive result, a quantifiable, undeniable positive result in people's lives, needs to be considered whenever we're looking to perfect our ashlar.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with that. I think it is valuable to look at what modern science has produced. For example, Freemasonry. I mean, the in the Fellowcraft degree, when we're taught about the seven liberal arts and sciences, I mean, one of the things that they were getting at, I think, in those early years when they started adding those things into our Masonic ritual, was that Masons are supposed to be learners, and we're not supposed to be just learning about our ritual and just learning about the kind of myth and history of Freemasonry, but we're supposed to be learners in a much broader sense, and to integrate learning about many other things into what it means to be a Mason.
Yeah, and that comes to play in being a well-rounded man, a
Yes.
well-rounded leader, a well-rounded professional husband, anything. And it fills me with joy whenever I come across someone who actually displays that kind of thirst for knowledge and
Mm.
that inquisitiveness that actually makes them, in my opinion, a lot more fun to engage with.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's like, you know, if you go to the pizza buffet and all they have is cheese pizza, you're probably not going to go back to that buffet, right? I mean, that's not much of a buffet, and so I think that a lot of times that's that's one of the things that draws us to Masonry. For many of us, is the fact that we experience the world and we experience life as this big, rich, mysterious, complex tapestry, work of art, and we want to participate in that, and we want to experience that in a deeper and more meaningful way. And if we're going to do that, then not only does it help to like broaden our own horizons with studies, but to connect with other brothers who have their own scope of studies and interests. And when we come together, And one of us is saying, well, yeah, I was looking into this over here and it gave me this insight and this perspective. And the other one says, well, yeah, that's kind of like when I was looking at it from this over here and it gave me this insight and this perspective. Then a kind of synergy starts to develop, and we can have insights and realizations about Masonry and how it can be meaningful in our lives that wouldn't happen otherwise.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Because every receptor, every individual who is doing their own study is filtering that through their own experience, through their own knowledge, and it's
Yeah.
limited just by those constraints. Whereas if you are engaging with someone who has a completely different point of view, completely different upbringing, education, life
Yes.
experience, they're going to color it in a different way that maybe you and I wouldn't consider coming from our own point of view.
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
this is one of the great strengths about the Masonic fraternity and tradition, is that we emphasize the importance of diversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's right there in Anderson's constitutions, that we're supposed to be a place where men who might not otherwise meet each other and be friends with each other can come together. And that diversity is part of our strength, and we should
Mm-hmm.
embrace that and enrich it.
That's wonderful. Now, all of this, it seems to be a very active and energetic way of seeking out light and seeking out knowledge.
Mhm.
Now, I would like to hear a little bit more in a more passive, more introspective kind of way. Is
Yeah.
there any knowledge to gain in the silence for us?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I think the fact that you asked the question that way indicates that you already know there is. um, yes. So, and there are a couple of ways that we can think about that. And I'll just back up a little bit and say that this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is because my experience of the kind of philosophical, spiritual, and esoteric side of Freemasonry is that it's often very intellectual, and people are all about reading books and sharing ideas. And that's a good thing. But that alone um, is only part of what's possible. And it doesn't give us a full spectrum of Masonic experience. And so we have to do this turning inward that you talked about, and learning to go into the silence within ourselves. And kind of the two main areas of value in that is that, one, by being still and being quiet and turning within ourselves, we instantly start to become more aware of all of those different parts of ourselves that I was talking about earlier. It's like when you go out in nature and you just find a place in the woods or on the bank of a lake, or on the shore of the ocean, and you just sit down and you just look at things and you just listen. There's so much going on there, and it can transport you into a different appreciation
Mm-hmm.
of the world. The same thing can happen if you will just turn within yourself and pay attention to all of these natural processes that are going on within your consciousness. You've got emotions, you've got different ways of thinking and thought patterns, you've got perceptions coming in through your senses, you've got memories, you've got imagination, all of these things happening. And to just sit quietly and be aware of all of that, um, it 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 gives you an awareness of self that you just can't have otherwise.
Mm.
It helps you understand, even without necessarily trying, it helps you understand better why you do things the way you do them, how you've become the person that you are, um, who you are becoming, and also at a deeper level, what you are in a very deep, mysterious, spiritual way, a way that we can't quite put into words. Um, so there's that. And then there's also the benefit of turning within and being silent, is a kind of virtuous quality called equanimity. And it's that ability to find balance, to find harmony, like we were talking about earlier, to find a way to be able to to be present in the middle of whatever it is that is actually going on in the moment, and not feel like we have to react to it in any particular way, whether that reaction is just instinctive or emotional, or whether that reaction is trying to satisfy some sort of rules that have been set up for us by society or our culture or whatever, but to actually just experience the reality of the present moment. The more we do that within ourselves, the more we're capable of doing that out in the world with other people. And that means we're less likely to respond like just do automatic responses, like programmed robots going through the motions of living rather than actually living.
That is so important to recognize. And you mentioned that ability to actually have a control over your response. And you see this in conversation all the time. If there's a little lull in a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
people go bananas. They might not have anything to say,
Yeah.
but God forbid that there's any kind of silence in a conversation or in a moment, and they want to fill it in with something.
Yeah.
And oftentimes there is so much to gain from that moment of peace, that moment of tranquility, of silence. And the other thing that I think is very powerful that you're talking about is having that presence of mind.
Mm.
Personally, my meditation is limited to mindfulness meditation. I practice.
Good
Uh,
practice.
thank you. I really enjoy it because I try to find moments that precede chaos
Mm-hmm.
in order for me to practice.
Mm.
So I work out of my home, and my home is relatively quiet during the day, and I have 2 young children that I pick up in the afternoon. They're great kids, but they're not quieter than my house. So
Yeah.
there's a moment of transition between going from complete silence and control to then going to a very dynamic and rapid changing situation.
Yes.
So because I pick up my children, I go through a little car loop to pick them up. And usually I show up there maybe 30, 40 minutes before it's time for me to pick them up. And I just, in my car, I practice my meditation. One thing that I notice is that it actually puts me in that calm state of mind, even if we switch to a chaos as soon as the kids come in and they're telling me about some kid that was being a jerk or anything like that. My response is more even keeled. I am more in
Yes.
control. I'm able to provide better advice instead of saying, "Now you punch them right in the mouth." As soon as they
Right.
instead of going to my default Puerto Rican upbringing response, I can go and actually give them some a more uh, a better advice.
Yes.
Now, the other thing we were talking about before we started recording is the lasting effect that practices like this can have even after you stop momentarily from doing those practices. Can you give us a little insight into how that works and your experience with it?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that happens as a result, and we've already been talking about this in a number of ways, is that one of the things that happens as a result of meditation and other kinds of contemplative practice is you not only become more aware of how your consciousness works, but you also start to develop um, new skills. And those skills, like any skills that we might develop in our lives, start to become habitual. So, for example, like we've just been talking about, that process of recognizing that that there's a difference between observing chaos and being caught up in it.
Mm.
Um, when you recognize within yourself that you're getting distracted, everybody who meditates knows what this is like. You sit down, you start trying to meditate, and you get distracted by something, or maybe your mind goes off on a tangent in a particular thought that you're chasing down. Um, and you think, oh my gosh, I've lost my concentration. I'm not focused on my meditation anymore. And so you bring yourself back. You just gently bring yourself back to that focal point, whatever it is for that meditation. Well, that's developing a habit that then carries over into your everyday life. So that if you're trying to get something done at work, you're sitting at your desk and you're trying to focus on writing a report, and you get a phone call and somebody has got a crisis that they need you to deal with, and you shift into crisis mode and you're dealing with that, and then you put the phone down, then you can have that habitual process go, okay, I got distracted, but I can bring myself back now and focus on this matter right at hand. And your psyche, the different parts of your consciousness, will cooperate with that. And that's a significant shift, because most of us know what it's like to recognize we've become distracted, but then have a hell of a time trying to get ourselves refocused. Well, the practice of meditation really helps with those internal dynamics of refocusing. And so there's a direct connection between what the practice does and a skill that's built that will then continue to be part of our lives, whether or not necessarily we're consistently practicing that on a daily basis in meditation.
That's wonderful. And I wanted to also highlight that you mentioned that going into a phone call, and that's that's a very jarring transition from
Yes.
a state of flow in your composition and then having that chaotic interruption. But it also plays that same role in something as simple as your wife talking to you, and then you start thinking about changing the oil in the car,
Yeah.
right?
Great example.
You know, that the famous phrase, like, "Are you listening to me?"
Mhm.
comes to mind. So practices like this can help you in those moments where you want to, when you have a kid telling you something very excited that happened to them,
Yeah.
and you're able to devote that attention and really help them feel important because you're actually paying attention to them.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the distraction is normal. It will happen. Even for the people who meditate for many, many years,
Yes, for sure.
the distraction comes, but being able to reconnect effectively into what the purposeful action is it's a very helpful skill to have.
Yeah. In fact, there was some research done several years ago on this, scientific research. They took meditators. I think the meditators that they were using in this case were Zen Buddhists, and then they had a control group that were just average people. And what they did was they told them to sit quietly, and they had them on some sensors, to like find out how their brain waves were doing, their galvanic skin response, all those things that kind of tell us whether a person is really relaxed and calm or not.
Mhm.
And so they would have them sitting there in this relaxed, calm state, and they would do something to startle them, like make a really loud bang behind them. And what they found was that the seasoned meditators and the run-of-the-mill ordinary folks that don't practice meditation both reacted to the bang very similarly. The initial reaction was very similar, the same kind of startle response. But the difference was that the seasoned meditators more quickly relaxed and went back to the state of mind they had been in before than those who didn't practice meditation.
Well, yeah, think about the implication that would have on a very critical job. Let's say something that's life or death, like people
Yeah.
that are in the medical field, out, EMS,
Oh, yeah.
their ability to be able to witness trauma and
Hmm.
curtail that shock and go back into effective mode, or
Right.
someone in the military out in the field, being shot out, being able to recover from being startled
Yes.
by a shot. Having this kind of skill could be the difference between life and death for someone in that critical role.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, increasingly, we're seeing meditative techniques being taught to people who are in professional roles like that. I mean, it's being used in the military. It's being used by SWAT teams in police. It's being used by fighter pilots. There are lots of people in these really high pressure situations who are learning to use meditative techniques as a way to be able to manage the extreme demands that they can encounter in their different forms of service. Now, on a kind of lighter note, meditative practices are also used by professional athletes and by Olympic athletes. They use visualization a lot for athletic purposes of actually closing their eyes and mentally going through all of the motions that they would be doing in the performance of their sport. And there's lots of research about this that shows how much difference it makes when athletes do that as opposed to just practicing in the way they would normally practice, that the two combined offer significant benefits. And so, I mean, if it's working for professional athletes, if it's working for people in the military and first responders, why wouldn't ordinary people want to embrace this stuff to improve their lives in many, many ways?
Yep, that's a great question. And getting to the source of what the resistance is, I think can be very cathartic. Understanding like what's my resistance to
Yes.
embracing the possibility of this being useful. Which reminds me, I was listening to your conversation um, in A Cult of Personality,
Oh, yeah.
and I did know about the origin of your book. Your book is The Contemplative Mason, and it deals with applying mindfulness and meditation and um, imagery
Mm-hmm.
to the craft. But whenever you started putting these thoughts together, you didn't use your name or you didn't append your name to the writing. Can you give us a little insight into the reason behind that?
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons for that. One was at the time, I just didn't want to be, I didn't want to make a spectacle out of myself. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I felt like it was that the importance of this was much bigger than me as a personality. And I knew my ego could be vulnerable to, to getting attention for this. Another thing was those were very different times Masonically. Um, you know, there's a lot that has happened in the last 18 years, 19 years. And that's when I originally put that manuscript, anonymous manuscript, online. Um, but at that time, it wasn't unusual to hear about brothers who were advocating this internal side of Masonry to be shunned and even to be silenced, completely silenced in the fraternity. And I didn't want to experience that either. But things have changed. And I think we're at a moment in history where, well, I've been referring to it as the American Masonic Renaissance. I think we are on the crest of the wave for the American Masonic Renaissance. And it's time, and we can see this happening all over the country now, for where brothers are coming out and saying, yes, this is important to me. This is one of the things that drew me to the fraternity. This is one of the things that I hoped to receive instruction and mentoring and guidance and support and fellowship in. Um, and uh, and it's right there in our ritual. Our ritual says that this is part of the Masonic experience or can be part of the Masonic experience. And so I decided that it was time for me to become public and, and to say, yes, we can be visible, we can be heard. And we also, another thing that motivated me too, and I have to say this is that there have been some mistakes made by people with interests like this in Masonry, coming out and saying that if you're not into the esoteric, if you're not a philosopher, if you're not a mystic or whatever, then you're not a real Mason, or you're not doing it right, or you're a lesser Mason of some sort. And I wanted to take a stand against that. I think that's divisive, and I think it's just plain wrong.
Mhm.
There are lots of ways to be a Mason. This is just one of them. And I think it offers a lot. And so we need to be public, and we need to be seen as regular guys, regular Masons. We're not the weirdos whose only Masonry is on the internet or in some secret room somewhere that nobody talks about.
That is so good that you make that point, because that divisiveness can be so detrimental to the craft. Well, I have friends whose main interest in the fraternity was to fulfill that void of having men uh, to look up to.
Yes.
Men who didn't grow up with surrounded by a grandfather, a father, and they had that void of their personal development, and they wanted that, and they found it in Masonry. That's a perfectly valid reason to be part
Yes.
of our organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's some side benefits to it too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are lots of reasons to be a Mason. I mean, there are a lot of guys that are drawn to the fraternity because they see all of the good things that we've done in society, and they want to be part of that. There are plenty of them that have that family tradition, and they see Masonry as a rite of passage to be welcomed into kind of like a circle of elders. There are Masons who see it as an opportunity to meet men who care about being a good guy. That's all of those things are important.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we should set up barriers between these different things that attract us and say, well, this is what it's really about, and if you're not onto this, well, then you're not really a Mason. I mean, our ritual says that what makes a Mason is the obligation.
Hmm.
And so how I answer my obligation can be very different from the way you answer your obligation or another brother answers his obligation. And our job is simply to respect and embrace those differences. It goes back to that diversity that we were talking about before.
Hmm. Yeah, and embracing that diversity just opens up to facets of life that we may be completely ignorant to, or we could be completely uh, unlikely to encounter just on our own.
Yeah, yes, that's so true. I mean, there's another good connection from what we were talking about there earlier. You know, and also I have to say this, that one of the things that is important to me, that is inextricable from this meditative and contemplative approach to Masonry, is that for me it's about becoming a more whole human being, a more whole, well integrated human being. And so if that's true, then all these other things that I have mentioned, the community service and good works, charitable works, the fellowship, and just having a good time with brothers that have similar values, you know, the part of being a rich tradition that has family ties to it. All of those things are part of me being a whole human being, me being that better man that we say Masonry is about. And so, why would I want to denigrate any of those things? Why would I want to reject any of those things?
Yeah.
Those are all important, and I want to be involved in all of those. And the more I grow as someone who practices contemplative methods, the the richer all of these different kinds of experiences become for me.
Could you give us a little preview of, and I say preview because your book is dedicated to this, it's dedicated to helping men in connecting what the contemplative practice is and their Masonic practice. But could you give us just a little glimpse into how that looks? Let's say um, there's either the worshipful master or someone within the leadership of the lodge uh, helps the brothers embrace some of the contemplative aspects of Masonry in a meeting? How would that look?
Yeah. It's done differently in different lodges. I've had the opportunity since writing the book to travel the country and experience many different lodges that are encouraging, if not actually practicing, contemplative methods as part of their lodge experience. And so for some, it happens before opening. Before the master starts the opening of the lodge, he just brings everybody to a moment of silence. That can be a really powerful way to make that shift from being kind of in what we might call the profane mode of consciousness, right? The way things run in the world outside the lodge, into a more focused and uh, peaceful, harmonious state of mind. And so then from that moment all the way through the opening of the lodge, there's this process of building on that initial silence and the qualities that it helped us bring into our awareness. Others include it at, so there's a part in many jurisdictions where there's an opportunity for the lodge musician to either lead the lodge in a song or maybe play a piece of music. This is part of the opening of lodge in many jurisdictions. I've seen lodges use that as an opportunity to play a meditative piece of music. In one lodge, in fact, they use a Tibetan singing bowl that I've been to, and use the sound of that singing bowl to help every man in the lodge kind of tune in together to be present and to let that sound bring a greater state of peace and harmony to each of them individually and to the lodge as a whole. In other jurisdictions, they wait until the opening is done, so that space between the opening of the lodge and the closing of the lodge. In most jurisdictions, what happens in that space is entirely at the master's discretion. That's when he is fully in charge and he doesn't have to follow any particular set of rules about what to do and when to do it. And so in some lodges, they wait until then. And that's when I have seen worshipful masters, in some cases, just say, we're going to sit in silence for 5 minutes. Or in other cases, I've seen them do some sort of a little guided meditation at that time. Another example is at the closing of lodge. There's very often, there's a little thing in there where the master asks if anyone has anything to offer for the good of Masonry. Well, that's an opportunity for a brother to stand up and say, worshipful master, I'd like to lead us in a short meditation for the good of Masonry. And the worshipful master says, let it be so. And then the meditation happens there. And then in other lodges, I've seen them wait until the closing is over. And after the closing of the lodge, they do some sort of a meditative or contemplative practice to help them make that shift of, let's take what we've been talking about and doing here out into the world with us as we leave. I had the opportunity in Nashua, New Hampshire, to be at an event there. It was an educational event in which they opened and closed lodge. And at the closing of lodge, a brother recited the closing charge. Now, this is optional in most jurisdictions, but it's something to really pay attention to. And he walked around the floor of the lodge as he recited the closing charge. And he made eye contact with each of us as he was walking around. And you could tell that he was speaking from his heart. It sounded like he was just speaking off the cuff. It was so beautiful and powerful. There's some really good stuff in that closing charge. And to embrace that as a contemplative experience is a powerful thing.
I love that. I love that. I hope that brothers who listen to this or watch our conversation, that they're inspired to look into the opportunities to implement some of this into the lodge and a great way would be to actually, if they can have a copy of your book. And I wanted to thank you for your generosity. For the brothers listening, I will be giving out a copy of Brother Dunning's book. This was out of his generosity. I'm very thankful for that, my brother.
My pleasure.
And I really hope that, you, whether you win it or not, that you actually get a copy and put some of this to work for you. I am a testament that some of these practices actually help an individual. They don't have a tie to any kind of religious practice that is going to rip you away from your religion and bring chaos to your family.
Right.
These are things that are part of our default package, if you will, and this can be one of those instruction manuals that can help you better utilize it. So I'll give details of the giveaway at the windingstairs.com. Go to the post where this is, and if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast or on YouTube, there should be a link in the description that will take you straight to the giveaway, and all the details are going to be there. I'll take care of the shipping. You have to worry about nothing. You just participate in it, and then good luck. I hope that you actually have this with you in a little bit. Brother, before we part ways, I wanted to ask you, I know that you're working on a new book, and
Yes.
this one is the title that I have here, tentatively, tell me if this is correct or not, is The Contemplative Lodge. Where are you in the process of this book right now?
It's currently in the publisher's hands. I'm told that it will be in print and for sale sometime soon.
Okay.
I'm hoping that it'll give us time for Christmas shopping. But yes, it's the Contemplative Lodge, and the subtitle is A Manual for Masons Doing Inner Work Together. The idea was this first book was really focused on individual practice. How can a brother begin to do contemplative practice as part of his Masonic experience? As I went around the country, brothers were telling me, hey, that's great and that's valuable, but we really like to practice together. And I definitely get that. There are benefits to that don't need to be overlooked. And so I wrote a book for that. I'm really excited about it. I think that it could be a very useful tool to a lot of lodges and other Masonic organizations, councils, chapters, you name it. So I'm really excited to see what can happen with this new book.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. Please come over and let us know whenever it's available so that we can share with the Brothers of the Winding Stairs. Brother Dunning, I want to be respectful of your time. I thank you so much for the wisdom for this conversation.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this greatly, and it's been wonderful to connect with another brother like you who values and embraces this kind of practice and wants to help other brothers benefit from it as well. I mean, we're taught to share these things with each other, to whisper good counsel, and so maybe we're whispering in a very 21st century way here.
I like that. I hope
Yeah.
that brothers actually listen to it. And I look forward to speaking to you again in the future. And to the brothers listening, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with us. And until next time, may your steps be firm and your path illuminated as we continue our journey up the winding stairs. Okay, I hope you found this conversation edifying, that you could take a little nugget of information there and apply it to your life and live a more contemplative life and enjoy this journey of Masonry, just like we have discussed in the conversation. And now I'll give you the details about the giveaway. This signed copy of Contemplative Masonry can be yours, and to enter is simple. All you have to do is subscribe to this channel, youtube.com/The Winding Stair. So if you're watching this on YouTube, just click on the subscribe button and click on the notification bell so that you don't miss any of our videos. The second step is for you to actually put a comment in the comment section telling me, what are you thinking of doing this year in order to make your contemplative experience a little bit more profound? Is there anything that you're going to do different? Are you going to listen more attentively to the different things in life, or to the lectures, or to the prayers? What are you planning on doing to live a more introspective and contemplative life this year? And finally, share it with someone. Choose your favorite social media network, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and share a link of this video so that you can also share the experience of having a more contemplative experience. So again, if you want a copy of Contemplative Masonry by Brother Chuck Dunning, follow those 3 steps. Subscribe, comment, and share, and you're automatically entered. I'll take care of the shipping if you live in the United States. I'll only ask you to take care of the shipping if you're outside of the United States, but it's open to anyone, anywhere. So good luck. I hope it comes your way. Take care.